Good evening, this is Jason from English Raven, or good morning, wherever you happen to be when you watch this tutorial. Um, this is the next in the Open English series, and this one's called For Rent. Not a very imaginative title there, I guess, but nonetheless, I think that's something that could be explored for language purposes, just that phrase, for rent. Um, and we've got a pretty cool image here in terms of it being a window with a for rent sign in it. Um, and the reason I like this photo actually is because it could be a house, it could be a business. So it could be somewhere where you would rent to live, or it could be a shop, for example, or some sort of business premise. So premises. So that's nice and flexible in terms of how that might be interpreted. Now, in previous tutorials, I've shown you a couple of different applications for this grid, and it was mostly focused on asking some questions and then getting responses from students. And you could do that with this one as well, but in order to show you a different application, um, with this particular picture, I think it would lend itself quite well to a little bit more imagination, a little bit of creativity. And in this case, um, the way I would probably use this material is to do what I call a chain story activity. And with a chain store activity, the general idea is that we will give the students the first caption or the first section of a little story, and it might be, for this kind of sign, it might be something as simple as um, the place was available for rent, or I saw the rent for rent sign in the window, dot dot dot. And then what the students will do on their pages here, in number 2, they will continue that story, but only inside this box. So it might be only one sentence or two sentences, depending on how small their writing is. But the idea is that they'll take that first beginning that we gave the whole class and they'll extend it in some way. Then what they'll do is, when everybody's finished doing that in box 2, they pass their paper to the left or to the right. It doesn't matter which direction you go as long as you continue going in that direction. They will then pass their papers to the left, for example, and the student who receives their paper will read the introduction again, read what the original student has written for the next part of the story, and then they will continue it based on what they've read. And that goes, you just continue that sequence. The student next to the original student will continue the story. When everybody's finished doing that, we pass the papers again. The next student reads those 3 and continues it, and so on until basically all these sections have been filled out. Number 12 will be a finish of some sort, hopefully. Now, even if you don't have 10, 11, 12 students in your class, it doesn't really matter. You could do this even with 3 or 4 students, and it just continues around. It'll come back to the original student. They'll read what's been put in and continue the story, and then we continue to circulate the story. I think one important thing, though, is that the students write their name here somewhere, so that when the activity has finished, we know which student the paper needs to go back to. And what we'll end up with is, well, if let's say you've got 7 students in your class, you'll have 7 completely different stories here. And in my experience, whether it's adults or children or teenagers, they tend to have a lot of fun with this and get a little bit silly. And I think it's good to get a bit silly sometimes. For example, I did this activity once with some teenagers in Korea, and one of the boys decided whenever he got another bit of paper from another student, didn't matter what had happened in the story, somehow he managed to make a superhero interrupt. So, in one story, as it was going around, it would suddenly say, and then Superman burst through the door and did blah blah blah. And then in someone else's story, it would say, and suddenly Batman swoop down from the ceiling. Um, or Spider-Man appeared from the corner or something like that, and it was just hilarious how in every story a superhero appeared, and it was the same guy doing this each time. And that might sound really silly, but the students just, when they were going back and reading over the stories that had been generated, they were getting a lot of laughs from it. But there was a thread, like the challenge was to keep the story going, and to look at what had been written just before and to make sure that the story kept going, and not, with ridiculous tangents that where number 7, for example, had no relation whatsoever to anything that had happened before. So it's really good for showcasing for the learners how to continue a thread, how to actually read before you write, that sort of thing. But it also gives them a chance to have a bit of fun and be a bit silly if they want to. And it's a real students get a real kick when their paper comes back to them and they read what happened to their story. It's kind of cool. And then the idea is that each student, once they get their paper back and all these boxes have been completed, that they'll read their stories out loud for the whole class to hear, and that's usually a good laugh. But while the stories are being read, the teacher could be pointing out good language or good examples of language. It's probably better to focus on the positive in this case rather than doing a lot of correction, because if there's a lot of correction involved, it might take the pleasure out of the activity a bit. This might be a bit more of a light-hearted application. And basically we've got this note taking place to explore some vocabulary or some language structures. Now, how do you follow up from that? Well, on the second page here, again, I've got something pretty simple, and it's just 12 horizontal boxes like that. And what I would probably do is ask the learners to, well, there's a couple of different ways. I could maybe ask them, based on what was written here, to write a better version of it, like to edit it and to change it in ways that make it more suitable for them. So they might have a chance to edit this story and make it a little bit more along the lines they want it. That's one way you could go on with it. Another thing might be to ask each student to have a look at the story parts that were written and to pick out their favorite sentence. Looking at all the stuff that was written down to say, well, my favorite sentence was blah blah blah, and then the teacher will write that sentence on the whiteboard, and all the students will write that sentence here, or we're going to take it in turn so that each student gets a turn to select the favorite sentence from their story, and we write the sentences in here, and then we give some explanatory notes and stuff next to it, whether that's to correct the sentence or to show how that pattern could be used for other sentences. Just exploring it as a piece of language. That's probably what I would do, because then we would go from a more of a fun narrative position to more of a bit of looking a bit closer at the language and exploring it as language. But again, as I said, the option might be you might just like them to have them edit and redo that story that was generated in different chunks on the previous page. So that's the chain story application, and that's one of the ways of following up. Now, as I keep mentioning in all these videos, remember that there's no one way to do this, and with the big advantage with it being open source is that you can go back to your other templates and paste in other stuff. If you would rather have a much more bottom-up, start with vocabulary, and then have the students do a dialogue, for example, all those other options are available in the other templates, and you can just cut and paste them in and replace what's here. It doesn't mean that the for rent resource has to be done this way, and I know I emphasize that in all the other ones, but just in case you were wondering, it's about being flexible. Again, you could have more of a finding out application here where we make questions, ask them to students, and then do something a bit different on this page. But you should try the chain story activity. You might be very pleasantly surprised at how well it works and how much students enjoy it, and some of the great language that comes out of it, and just having a good time with your English. being creative, being a bit humorous. I've always gotten a real kick out of the chain story activity, and I found it's really great for them to take that enjoyment and to generate some, let the students choose their favorite parts in terms of the language or the content, and then to explore those favorite parts as a class, as a group. And I've always found that being received really well by students, irrespective of their age or level, really. And again, again, this really does cater to the student's own level as well. It doesn't matter if these are really simple sentences from kids to quite sophisticated stuff from higher levels. So that's the For Rent resource from Open English on English Raven. I hope that's given you some ideas, and good luck with it. Have fun with your Open English.